The rain came down in sheets that December afternoon, turning the Burmese jungle floor into a swamp of red clay and rotting vegetation. Captain James Wright wiped the water from his eyes for the 100th time, his Royal Engineer's uniform clinging to his skin like a second layer of misery. He'd been in Burma for 8 months now, long enough to know that the jungle never gave up its secrets willingly. His patrol had stumbled onto the abandoned Japanese position purely by accident. The enemy had pulled back 3 days earlier, leaving behind the usual debris of hasty retreat. Empty ammunition crates, discarded rations, a few burned-out vehicles. Nothing unusual, nothing worth a second look, but something had caught Wright's attention as they prepared to move on. A glint of metal beneath a collapsed bamboo shelter half buried in mud. "Sergeant Davidson," Wright called out, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Get over here." Davidson splashed through the muck, his rifle held high to keep it dry. He was a good man, steady under fire, the kind of soldier who asked questions later and followed orders first. He'd saved Wright's life twice in the past month alone. Wright pointed at the metallic edge protruding from the earth. "Help me dig this out." They worked in silence, their hands slipping in the wet clay, pulling away layers of mud and debris. What emerged made Wright's breath catch in his throat. It was a metal casing, scorched black in places, riddled with bullet holes, but unmistakably intact. The craftsmanship was too precise, too deliberate to be anything ordinary. And the components visible through the damaged sections, the vacuum tubes, the wiring configurations, the antenna mount, they told a story that Wright's mind struggled to accept. "What is it, sir?" Davidson asked, crouching beside him. Wright didn't answer immediately. He was too busy tracing the circuit pathways with his eyes, recognizing patterns that shouldn't exist. Not here. Not in the hands of an enemy that British intelligence had assured them was fighting a primitive war, relying on courage and numbers rather than technology. "It's a radar system," Wright finally said, his voice hollow. "Japanese radar," Davidson frowned. "But sir, I thought the Japs didn't have—" "They don't. According to every briefing we've received, every intelligence report from London and Delhi, Japan doesn't have radar technology. They're supposed to be fighting blind, navigating by stars, relying on visual spotting and basic radio." Wright's hands trembled as he examined the device more closely. "But this says otherwise." The implications crashed over him like the monsoon rain. For 3 years, Allied forces had operated under a dangerous assumption. They'd believed the enemy couldn't see them coming, that darkness and cloud cover provided protection, that their technological superiority was absolute. Every night bombing raid, every naval approach, every tactical movement had been planned with the confidence that Japan was fighting a backward war. What if they'd been wrong the entire time? Wright's mind raced through the battles he'd heard about, the casualties that seemed higher than expected, the Japanese defensive fire that was suspiciously accurate even in poor visibility. The Battle of the Java Sea, where Allied ships had been picked off with uncanny precision. The bombing raids on Rabaul, where Japanese fighters seemed to know exactly when Allied aircraft were approaching. The night operations in Burma, where anti-aircraft batteries opened up with perfect timing despite monsoon conditions. They'd attributed it to Japanese skill, to fanaticism, to luck. "Never to technology, sir." Davidson's voice pulled him back to the present. "What do we do?" Wright looked at the radar unit, then at his sergeant. The rain continued to fall, washing rivulets of red mud across the damaged casing. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder. A reminder that the war was still very much alive around them. "We get this to Kolkata," Wright said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Davidson straighten. "Tonight? I don't care if we have to carry it ourselves through every mile of jungle between here and headquarters. This changes everything." Davidson nodded slowly, understanding the gravity in his captain's tone, even if he didn't fully grasp the implications. "I'll organize a detail, sir. We'll need to move carefully. The Japanese might come back for it." "They already left it behind," Wright said, staring at the device. "They probably thought it was too damaged to be useful, or maybe they were in too much of a hurry. But they made a mistake leaving this where we could find it." As Davidson moved away to gather men for the extraction, Wright remained crouched in the mud, unable to tear his eyes from the radar system. This wasn't just another piece of salvaged equipment. This was evidence of a parallel war that had been raging beneath the surface of the conflict everyone knew about. An invisible war of wavelengths and frequencies, of detection and deception. September 1945. Tokyo Bay. The war was over, but Maurice Price's work had only just begun. He stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the ruins of Tokyo slide past. The city was a landscape of devastation. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash and rubble, twisted metal frameworks jutting from the ground like skeletal fingers. The firebombing campaigns had done their work thoroughly, yet somewhere in this destruction, hidden in laboratories and factories, lay the physical evidence of Japan's secret electronic war. Price was part of Operation Intelligence Targets, a joint Allied effort to catalog and secure Japanese military technology before it could be destroyed, hidden, or lost to history. His specific mission was to locate radar research facilities, interview engineers, and document the full scope of Japan's detection systems. After months of analyzing fragments and correlating reports, he would finally see the complete picture. Lieutenant Hayes, the translator who'd helped interview Commander Tanaka, stood beside him. The Naval Technical Research Institute at Meguro is still standing. Damaged, but structurally intact. That's our first stop. How cooperative have the Japanese engineers been? Price asked. Hayes smiled slightly. More than you'd expect. Many of them are actually eager to show us their work. They want recognition, proof that Japanese science wasn't inferior. It's almost, he paused, searching for words. Almost like they've been waiting 3 years to say we told you we could do this. The institute was a sprawling complex of buildings. Several showing bomb damage, but others remarkably preserved. As Price's team approached, a group of Japanese civilians waited at the entrance. Men in worn suits and faded laboratory coats, their faces carrying exhaustion and something else. Pride, Price realized. Professional pride that had survived defeat. An older man stepped forward, bowing slightly. Hayes translated his introduction. This is Dr. Shinichi Kobayashi. He led magnetron development for the Navy's radar program from 1938 through the end of the war. Dr. Kobayashi spoke in careful English, his accent heavy but his words clear. Welcome. Commander Price, we have preserved our research. Please come see what we built. The laboratory was a revelation. Rows of workbenches held radar components in various stages of development. Magnetrons, waveguides, antenna arrays, circuit boards. Detailed schematics covered the walls. Test equipment lined shelves. This wasn't a primitive operation cobbled together with captured technology. This was a sophisticated research program that had been running for nearly a decade. Dr. Kobayashi led them to a workbench where a magnetron sat mounted in a test fixture. 1939 prototype, he said, his voice carrying unmistakable pride. We demonstrated microwave radar generation that year. 5 years before your intelligence reports said Japan had any radar capability. Price examined the device carefully. It was crude by 1945 standards, but the engineering was elegant. Clever solutions to complex problems, innovations born from limited resources forcing creative thinking. Why didn't Allied intelligence know about this? Kobayashi's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps because you didn't want to know. We published some early research in international journals, 1937, 1938. Basic theory, electromagnetic wave propagation. Your scientists could have read them, but I think... He paused, choosing words carefully. I think you assumed Japanese physicists couldn't possibly understand such advanced concepts. So you didn't look. The accusation was delivered without malice, just a statement of fact that made it all the more damning. Eleanor, who'd accompanied Price to Tokyo, was photographing everything, her camera clicking steadily as she documented the evidence. Show us the Type 13 system, Price requested. That was your primary air search radar, correct? Kobayashi nodded and led them to another section of the laboratory, where a complete Type 13 unit stood, its antenna array carefully preserved. Operational from 1941. Detection range over 100 kilometers for aircraft formations. We deployed these at over 100 stations, coastal positions, island bases, major cities. They formed our early warning network. Price walked around the system, noting design elements that paralleled British and American radar, but with distinct innovations. How effective was it? Very effective when properly maintained and operated, Kobayashi replied. We detected American bomber formations from Saipan, while they were still far out over the ocean. Gave us 30 to 40 minutes warning time to scramble fighters and prepare defenses. Your B-29 raids, we saw them all coming. But you couldn't stop them, Eleanor observed quietly. Kobayashi's face fell. No. By 1945, we had detection capability, but insufficient fighters, insufficient fuel, insufficient everything, except the ability to see our own destruction approaching. We watched on radar as your bombers formed up over the Pacific. We tracked them as they flew toward our cities. We knew exactly when they would arrive, and we could do nothing. His voice carried profound sadness. Perhaps it would have been better not to see. The comment hung in the air, a poignant acknowledgement that technology without resources was just a window to watch defeat unfold. Price felt an unexpected sympathy for these engineers, who'd built sophisticated systems only to witness their nation's infrastructure crumble, despite their innovations. Over the following days, Price's team documented everything. They visited the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal where Type 2 surface search radars had been manufactured, over 800 units produced between 1941 and 1945. They examined the Japan Radio Company facility where Type 21 air search radars were built. They toured coastal radar stations where operators had tracked Allied naval movements throughout the war. At each location, Japanese engineers and technicians eagerly explained their work, demonstrated equipment, provided technical specifications. It was a strange dynamic. Defeated enemies teaching their conquerors about weapons that had killed Allied forces. But Price understood the psychology driving it. These men needed their achievements recognized, needed history to record that Japanese engineering had been world-class even if Japanese military strategy had failed. Lieutenant Commander Maurice Price sat in his cramped office in London, surrounded by towers of paper that threatened to avalanche at the slightest provocation. Outside, the city was still celebrating the end of the war in Europe, but inside the nondescript building that housed the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, there was no room for celebration. Price had work to do, and what he was discovering kept him awake at night. The file in front of him was labeled Electromagnetic Anomalies, Singapore Station. January through February, 1942. It had been gathering dust in the archives for 3 years. Dismissed as irrelevant, filed away and forgotten. But Price wasn't the type to let things stay forgotten. Before the war, he'd been a physicist at Oxford, trained to see patterns where others saw only noise. And these reports were screaming a pattern that no one had wanted to hear. Strange. Interference detected at 0200 hours, read one. Entry dated February 3rd. Pulsed signals, regular intervals, source unknown. Recommend investigation. Another entry, February 8th. Electromagnetic signatures consistent with radar operation observed northeast of position. Unable to identify origin. Japanese forces in area. February 12th, just 3 days before Singapore fell. Multiple anomalous readings. Equipment detecting pulses that match profile of radar systems. Request permission to investigate possible Japanese electronic warfare capabilities. The final entry was dated February 14th, written in a hasty scrawl. Evacuating station. Enemy approaching. Strong electromagnetic activity suggests... The sentence ended there, unfinished. The next day, Singapore surrendered, and 80,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war. Price closed the file and rubbed his tired eyes. The operators at Singapore had seen it. They'd reported it. They'd asked for investigation, and they'd been ignored because the narrative was too comfortable, too convenient to question. Japan was technologically backward. Japan didn't have radar. Japan was brave and fanatical, yes, but primitive in their warfare, except they weren't. The door to his office opened without warning, and Dr. Eleanor Brennan stepped inside, carrying another stack of files that made Price's heart sink. Eleanor was brilliant, uncompromising, and had a talent for finding connections that others missed. She'd been working with him for 2 months now, ever since Captain Wright's discovery in Burma had landed on their desks and turned everything upside down. "You're going to want to see these," Eleanor said, dropping the files onto his desk with a thud that sent papers fluttering. "I've been going through pilot debriefing reports from Burma and the Philippines. Maurice, it's everywhere. Price leaned forward, dreading what he was about to learn. Show me. Eleanor pulled out a transcript dated November 1943. Flight Lieutenant Peter Mackenzie, Wellington Bomber Crew. Night raid on Japanese positions near Mandalay. Listen to this. We maintained radio silence and approached at low altitude to avoid detection. Weather conditions were poor, heavy cloud cover and rain. We expected to achieve complete surprise, but anti-aircraft fire began before we reached the target zone. The fire was too accurate for visual spotting. It was as if they knew exactly where we were. She pulled out another report. Commander Thomas Harding, Destroyer Operations in the Pacific, April 1944. Japanese vessels altered course before we came into visual range. Conditions were dark, rough seas, no moon. Yet they maneuvered as though they could see us approaching. We attributed it to excellent seamanship, but the precision was remarkable. Report after report, Eleanor laid them out like cards in a deadly game. Pilots who swore they were being tracked through weather that made visual navigation impossible. Ship commanders who watched Japanese forces react to their movements before any visual contact could have been made. Ground forces who reported suspiciously accurate artillery fire despite maintaining complete concealment. They were seeing us the whole time, Price said softly, the weight of realization settling over him like a shroud, and we dismissed every single warning sign because it didn't fit what we believed about them. Eleanor sat down across from him, her expression grim. It's worse than that. I found communications from Dutch forces in the East Indies, early 1942. They reported detecting radar signals from Japanese ships and sent the intelligence to Allied command. The response was, she pulled out a memo. Quote, intelligence assessment concludes Japanese forces do not possess radar technology. Reported signals likely atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction. They literally told the Dutch they were wrong because Japan wasn't supposed to have radar. Price felt a cold anger building in his chest. It wasn't directed at the Japanese. They'd simply fought a smart war, using every advantage they had. The anger was directed inward, at the comfortable assumptions that had blinded Allied intelligence to the truth, at the prejudice that had insisted an Asian nation couldn't possibly match Western technological achievement. How many men died because of this? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. I've been trying to calculate that, Eleanor said quietly. Every operation where surprise was expected but anti-aircraft fire was unusually accurate. Every night raid where Japanese fighters intercepted despite weather conditions. Every naval engagement where Japanese forces seemed to anticipate Allied movements. She paused, her voice dropping. Conservatively? Thousands, maybe more. The silence in the office was broken only by the sound of rain beginning to fall outside, tapping against the windows like accusatory fingers. Price thought about all those pilots climbing into their aircraft, confident that darkness would protect them. All those ship crews sailing toward enemy positions, believing they were unseen. All those young men who died because intelligence had failed them. The device Captain Wright found, Price said, forcing himself to focus on what could be done now, rather than dwelling on what couldn't be undone. We've had it for 5 months. What have we learned? Eleanor's expression shifted from grief to professional focus. It's sophisticated. Type 22 air search radar, we think, based on the frequency range and components. The Japanese must have been developing it since at least the late 1930s. The technology isn't as advanced as our current systems, but it's far from primitive. They solved the same engineering problems we did, magnetron design, pulse modulation, antenna efficiency, just differently. Independently, Price added. Yes, which means they had scientists and engineers who were just as capable as ours, working in parallel, solving the same problems. And we never knew because we never looked. We assumed superiority and stopped questioning. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnez pas préfet. Maurice Price stood before a mahogany table in Whitehall, facing a room full of men who didn't want to hear what he had to say. The Joint Intelligence Committee had assembled at his request, though the skepticism radiating from the assembled officers and officials was almost palpable. These were men accustomed to being right, to making decisions that shaped the course of the war. They didn't appreciate being told they'd been catastrophically wrong for 3 years. Gentlemen, Price began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. What I'm about to present challenges everything we've believed about Japanese technological capabilities. I ask that you hear the evidence before drawing conclusions. Air Chief Marshal Sir Douglas Kemp leaned back in his chair, his expression already dismissive. Commander Price, we've reviewed your preliminary report. Frankly, it reads like speculation built on a few salvaged components. The Japanese have been thoroughly beaten in the Pacific. If they had sophisticated radar, why didn't it save them? Because having technology and having enough of it are different things, sir, Price replied calmly. Japan's industrial capacity was always their weakness, not their engineering capability. But the radar they did deploy was effective. Devastatingly so. He nodded to Eleanor, who began distributing folders to each man at the table. Inside were photographs of the captured radar unit. Technical schematics they'd reverse engineered, and most damning of all, operational reports that Price and Eleanor had spent months correlating. This is a Type 22 air search radar, Price continued. Found in Burma last December. We've since recovered fragments of similar systems from the Philippines and Okinawa. Based on component dating and manufacturing marks, we believe this design was operational by 1941 at the latest. Possibly earlier. Admiral Sir Henry Morrison flipped through the folder, his brow furrowing. 1941? That's impossible. Our intelligence assessments from that period explicitly stated that Japan had no radar capability whatsoever, Price interrupted, his voice taking on an edge he couldn't quite suppress. Yes, sir. Those assessments were wrong. Catastrophically, fatally wrong. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one liked admitting failure, especially not failure that had cost lives. Kemp's face reddened. That's a rather bold accusation, Commander. What evidence do you have beyond a single damaged device that could have been captured from us? Eleanor spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. The components are Japanese manufacture, sir. The vacuum tubes use a design we've never employed. The circuit configurations are unique. And the frequency ranges, she pulled out a technical diagram. They differ from Allied radar by enough that there's no possibility of this being our technology. Price pressed forward, knowing he had to make them understand before their pride erected an impenetrable wall. But the real evidence isn't in the hardware. It's in the operational reports. Dr. Brennan and I have reviewed over 300 after-action reports from Burma, the Philippines, and the Pacific Theater. We found a consistent pattern. He pulled out a map and spread it on the table, marked with dozens of colored pins. Each pin represents an operation where Allied forces experienced unexpectedly accurate enemy response, despite conditions that should have prevented detection. Night operations, poor weather, maintained radio silence, all the tactical advantages that should have guaranteed surprise. His finger traced across the map, connecting the pins. Battle of the Java Sea, February 1942. Allied fleet operating under radio silence, expecting to catch Japanese forces unprepared. Instead, Japanese ships were perfectly positioned for intercept. 5 Allied ships sunk, over 2,000 casualties. Morrison leaned forward, studying the map more closely. We attributed that to superior Japanese tactics, or to the fact that Japanese ships had Type 2 surface search radar with a detection range of 30 kilometers, Price countered. They saw us coming from the moment we left port. There was no surprise, no tactical advantage. We sailed straight into a trap. He moved his finger to another cluster of pins. November 1943, bombing raids on Rabaul. American bombers expected to catch Japanese ships in harbor. Instead, Japanese Type 13 radar detected them over 100 kilometers out. Fighters were airborne and positioned for intercept before the bombers arrived. 15 aircraft lost. This is speculation, Kemp said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Is it? Eleanor interjected, pulling out a transcript. This is from Flight Lieutenant Peter Mackenzie, who flew Wellington bombers in Burma. Quote, the anti-aircraft fire would start before we even reached the target. They knew we were coming. We thought it was spotters or spies. Never occurred to us they had radar. End quote. She laid out another transcript. Commander Thomas Harding, destroyer operations. Japanese ships would change course just before we came into visual range. In the dark, in rough seas, they'd maneuver like they could see us. Another quote. We chalked it up to luck or brilliant seamanship, but it wasn't luck, was it? Price watched the faces around the table. Some men were beginning to understand. Others were still resistant, clinging to the comfortable narrative that had sustained them through years of war. He needed to break through that final wall of denial. "Gentlemen, I've calculated conservatively," Price said, his voice quiet but firm. "Based solely on documented operations where Japanese radar likely provided tactical advantage, Allied casualties were 15 to 20% higher than they should have been. Across 3 years of Pacific fighting, that translates to thousands of men. Pilots shot down, ships sunk, ground forces ambushed. Thousands of men who died because we didn't know what we were facing." The silence that followed was profound. Morrison had gone pale. Even Kemp seemed shaken, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something that looked like dawning horror. "Why didn't we know?" Morrison asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the question Price had been dreading, because the answer indicted everyone in the room, himself included. "Because we saw what we expected to see, sir. We had intelligence reports that didn't fit our preconceptions, so we dismissed them. The radar operators at Singapore reported electromagnetic anomalies for weeks before the fall. They were ignored. Dutch forces detected radar signals from Japanese ships and reported them. They were told they were wrong because Japan wasn't supposed to have radar." Price paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "We failed to recognize enemy capabilities because the idea that Japan, an Asian nation, a culture we viewed as traditional and backward, could match Western technological achievement was psychologically uncomfortable. We needed to believe we were superior. That need blinded us to evidence that was right in front of us the entire time." "This is absurd," Kemp said, but there was no strength behind the words. He was looking at the map, at the pins, at the undeniable pattern they created. "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "Or is it just uncomfortable?" "Because there's a difference between absurd and inconvenient truth." Price gathered his papers, preparing for what he knew would be a long, difficult afternoon of questions and arguments and slow, grudging acceptance. But he'd planted the seed. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore, too well documented to dismiss. They would resist, they would argue, they would try to minimize the implications. But eventually, they would have to face the truth. They'd underestimated the enemy, and men had died because of it. Part 5. The Reckoning. Maurice Price's full report landed on desks across Whitehall and the Pentagon in late July 1945, just weeks before atomic bombs would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The document was 400 pages of meticulous documentation, technical analysis, and uncomfortable truths. Price had titled it simply, "Japanese Radar Systems, a Reassessment of Enemy Capabilities and Allied Intelligence Failures." The reaction was immediate and explosive. In a windowless conference room deep within the Admiralty building, Price stood before an emergency session of the Joint Intelligence Committee. This time the atmosphere was different. The skepticism had been replaced by anger, not directed at him, but inward, at the system that had failed so spectacularly. Admiral Morrison slammed his hand on the table, his face flushed. 3,000 units. 3,000! And our assessment from 1941 said they had none, zero. How does an intelligence apparatus make an error of that magnitude? "Because we chose comfort over truth, sir," Price replied, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. "We had evidence, fragmentary, scattered, but present. Singapore operators reported electromagnetic anomalies. Dutch forces detected radar signals. Pilots reported suspiciously accurate anti-aircraft fire. Ship commanders noted impossibly precise Japanese maneuvers in darkness. The clues were there. We dismissed them because accepting them meant accepting that Japan was technologically sophisticated, and that contradicted the narrative we needed to believe." Air Chief Marshal Kemp, who'd been so dismissive in their first meeting, now looked like he'd aged a decade. "The casualties. Your estimate of 15 to 20%. Walk me through that calculation again." Eleanor stood, spreading documentation across the table. "We analyzed 347 operations where Allied forces expected tactical surprise, but encountered resistance suggesting prior detection. Night bombing raids where anti-aircraft fire began before visual contact was possible. Naval approaches where Japanese forces repositioned before Allied vessels came within sight range. Ground operations where defensive fire was too accurate for the conditions. She pointed to a chart showing casualty rates. In operations where we now know Japanese radar was present and operational, Allied casualties averaged 18% higher than similar operations in areas where radar coverage was absent. That's not speculation. That's statistical analysis of actual after-action reports. 18%, Morrison repeated, his voice hollow. Across how many men? Thousands, sir, Price said quietly. The exact number is impossible to determine, but conservatively, several thousand Allied personnel died in situations where Japanese radar provided detection capability we didn't know existed. They flew into combat, sailed into battle, advanced on positions, all believing they had advantages they didn't actually have. The silence that followed was broken by Brigadier General Frank Coleman, an American liaison officer who'd been sitting quietly throughout the meeting. What burns me most isn't that they had radar. It's that we told ourselves they couldn't. I've read through the intelligence assessments from 1940 through 1943. They're not cautious analyses that turned out wrong. They're confident declarations that Japan lacked technological sophistication. We didn't say, probably doesn't have radar or unlikely to possess advanced systems. We said they definitely didn't have it. That's not intelligence. That's prejudice dressed up as analysis. Price nodded slowly. General Coleman is correct. Our intelligence failure wasn't about missing evidence. It was about dismissing evidence because it contradicted our assumptions about Japanese capabilities. We believed Asian nations couldn't match Western technological achievement. That belief was rooted in cultural prejudice, and it cost lives. So what do we do now? Morrison asked, spreading his hands helplessly. The war is nearly over. Japan is beaten. Do we just file this away? Pretend it didn't happen? No, sir, Price said firmly. We learn from it. We document it. We make sure future intelligence analysts understand how cognitive bias can corrupt analysis, how assumptions can be more dangerous than enemy weapons. This report needs to become required reading at every intelligence training facility. The lesson is too important to bury. Kemp looked at Price with something approaching respect for the first time. You're proposing we essentially publish our own failure? Immortalize our mistakes? I'm proposing we honor the men who died by ensuring their deaths teach the lessons that might save lives in future conflicts, Price replied. Hiding this helps no one. Understanding it might help everyone. The committee debated for 3 more hours, arguing about classification levels, distribution, and whether the report should be sanitized to minimize embarrassment. Price listened to it all with growing frustration. They still didn't fully understand. This wasn't about protecting reputations or institutional pride. This was about acknowledging a fundamental failure that had killed Allied soldiers. Finally, Morrison called for order. The report will be classified top secret, but distributed to all major intelligence and military commands. Commander Price will prepare a supplementary training document outlining the key lessons. And, he paused, looking around the table, we'll establish a new protocol. Any intelligence assessment that declares an enemy incapable of something must include analysis of the evidence supporting that conclusion. No more confident declarations based on assumptions about what an enemy should or shouldn't be able to do. It was a small victory, but Price would take it. At least they were acknowledging the problem, even if grudgingly. As the meeting broke up, Eleanor approached him, her expression troubled. I spoke with Flight Lieutenant Mackenzie yesterday. The Wellington pilot who flew those night raids in Burma. I wanted to tell him what we'd discovered, that he'd been right about being tracked. How did he take it? Price asked. He cried, Eleanor said softly. He lost his entire crew on his last mission. They went down in flames over Mandalay, 1944. He'd spent a year believing he'd made tactical errors, that he'd somehow given away their position. Finding out the Japanese were tracking them with radar the whole time, that his crew never had a chance at surprise. It broke something in him. Price felt the weight of that settle over him like a physical burden. How many others are carrying that guilt? Commanders who think they made strategic mistakes. Pilots who believe they failed their crews. Ship captains who blame themselves for losses. All of them tormented by responsibility for deaths that were caused by intelligence failures they never knew about. We can't tell them all, Eleanor said. Most of this will stay classified for years. They'll die thinking they failed when the real failure was ours. I know, Price said, his voice thick. That's another cost to add to the ledger. Not just the lives lost, but the guilt borne by survivors who deserved to know the truth. Later that evening, Price sat alone in his office, staring at a map of the Pacific Theater covered in pins marking radar installations they'd now documented. Each pin represented a station where Japanese forces had watched Allied movements, where the electromagnetic ghosts that Singapore operators had reported were actually sophisticated detection systems doing exactly what they were designed to do. Commander Tanaka's words echoed in his mind. "We saw everything." Price pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began writing a letter he knew he could never send, addressed to all the Allied forces who'd fought and died in the Pacific, believing they were facing an enemy who fought blind. You deserved to know what you were up against. You deserved intelligence that questioned its assumptions instead of clinging to comfortable narratives. You deserved commanders who believed evidence over prejudice. Your courage was never in doubt. Your sacrifice was real, but you were fighting a war your intelligence services didn't fully understand, and that failure is on us, not you. He folded the letter carefully and locked it in his desk drawer. It was inadequate, insufficient, a poor substitute for the accountability those men deserved. But it was all he could offer, a private acknowledgement of a public failure that would remain classified for decades. Outside his window, London continued its victory celebrations, unaware that in offices like his, men and women were discovering just how costly their assumptions had been. The interrogation room at the Allied detention facility in Manila was sparse and humid, the tropical heat making the air feel thick enough to chew. Maurice Price sat across from Commander Yoji Tanaka, a Japanese naval engineer who'd been captured on Okinawa 3 weeks earlier. Between them sat Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a translator who'd lived in Tokyo before the war and spoke Japanese fluently. Tanaka was thin, his uniform threadbare, but his eyes held a sharpness that suggested his mind remained unbroken despite Japan's surrender. He'd agreed to this interview without hesitation, which had surprised Price. Most captured Japanese officers refused to speak, bound by honor and duty, even in defeat. "Commander Tanaka," Price began, waiting for Hayes to translate. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I understand you worked on radar development for the Imperial Navy?" Tanaka listened to the translation, then responded in rapid Japanese. Hayes translated. "I helped develop the Type 13 air search radar. I was part of the team at the Naval Technical Research Institute from 1938 until 1944. Price felt his pulse quicken. 1938. That was before the war even started, before most Allied intelligence believed Japan had any electronic warfare capability at all. "When did Japan begin developing radar?" Price asked, leaning forward. Tanaka's response came with what Hayes translated as a hint of professional pride. Serious development began in 1936, inspired by published Western research. But we knew we couldn't simply copy your designs. We had to innovate, to solve problems with the materials and manufacturing capabilities we had available. By 1939, we had working prototypes. By 1941, we were installing systems on warships and at coastal stations. Eleanor, seated beside Price, exchanged a glance with him that conveyed what they were both thinking. Allied. Intelligence assessments from 1941 had confidently declared Japan had no radar whatsoever. They'd been wrong by 5 years, maybe more. "Did you know Allied intelligence believed Japan had no radar capability?" Price asked carefully. Tanaka smiled for the first time, a bitter expression that didn't reach his eyes. Hayes translated his response. "Yes. We knew. Your intelligence reports were sometimes captured, sometimes intercepted. We read them with great interest. You consistently underestimated us, assumed we were fighting blind. We decided to use that assumption against you." The words hung in the humid air like an accusation. Price felt something twist in his chest, not anger at Tanaka, but at the comfortable prejudice that had allowed this deception to work so effectively. "How many Allied operations did your radar detect?" Price asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Tanaka was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, Hayes's translation came slowly, as if the translator himself was shocked by what he was hearing. All of them. Every raid on Rabaul, every convoy to Burma, every naval movement within range of our stations. If Allied forces came within detection range, we saw them. We tracked them. We passed that information to our fighter squadrons, our anti-aircraft batteries, our naval commanders. Eleanor made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sigh. Price felt the room tilt slightly, the implications crashing over him. All of them. Every mission where Allied forces believed they had the element of surprise, where commanders planned operations assuming the enemy was blind, where young men flew into combat confident that darkness or weather protected them. The Japanese had been watching the entire time. "Why are you telling us this?" Price asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Tanaka's response, translated by Hayes, carried a weight of resignation and defiance. "Because Japan has surrendered, but Japanese engineering has not been defeated. I want you to know that our scientists were not inferior. Our engineers were not primitive. We solved the same problems you did, reached similar solutions, developed parallel technologies. You won the war with superior numbers and industrial capacity, not superior minds. That distinction matters to me." Price understood then. This wasn't betrayal or collaboration. This was professional pride, a scientist's need to have his work acknowledged even in defeat. Tanaka wanted history to record that Japanese engineering had been world-class, that their defeat had been logistical and strategic, not intellectual. "Tell me about the Battle of the Java Sea," Price said quietly. "February 1942. Allied fleet, our ships, sailed to intercept your invasion force. We lost 5 vessels, over 2,000 men. What did your radar tell you?" Tanaka's expression grew somber. Through Hayes, he said, "We tracked your fleet from departure. Distance, speed, heading, everything. Our commanders knew exactly where you were, where you would be. It was not a battle. It was an interception of an enemy who believed they were unseen. I remember celebrating the victory, but also feeling troubled. You sailed into a trap you didn't know existed." "Troubled?" Eleanor asked, speaking for the first time. Tanaka looked at her directly as he responded, his voice carrying what Hayes translated as genuine regret. "War is war. But there is honor in facing an enemy who knows what they're fighting against. You did not know. Your men died thinking they had made tactical errors, that Japanese commanders were brilliant strategists. They didn't know we could see them coming from kilometers away. That felt not honorable, effective, but not honorable." The distinction struck Price as profoundly sad. Even the enemy engineer who'd helped build the systems that killed Allied forces felt uncomfortable with how effectively the deception had worked. It spoke to a fundamental failure of intelligence so complete that even Japanese officers found it troubling. "How many radar systems did Japan deploy during the war?" Price asked. Tanaka's answer came with specific details that made Eleanor start taking rapid notes. "Over 3,000 units. Type 21 air search radar, over 500 units produced. Type 13 early warning radar, deployed at over 100 locations across the Pacific. Type 2 surface search radar, installed on virtually every major warship from 1941 onward. Fire control radars for anti-aircraft guns, portable radars for ground forces, even airborne radars for night fighters, though those came late in the war. 3,000 units." Price thought about the intelligence assessment that had claimed Japan had no radar at all. The magnitude of the failure was staggering. It wasn't a minor oversight or a small gap in knowledge. It was a wholesale blindness to an entire dimension of the enemy's capabilities. "Why didn't we capture more of them earlier in the war?" Eleanor asked. "Why did it take until 1944 for us to find conclusive evidence?" Tanaka's response revealed another layer of the deception. Operational security. When positions were overrun, radar units were destroyed first. We had specific protocols, SMASH. The components burn the circuits, eliminate evidence. The equipment was too valuable to allow capture. And your forces weren't looking for radar anyway. When you found unusual antennas or electronic equipment, your reports called them communications gear or weather instruments. You saw what you expected to see.